Elden Ring bosses. Some people love them, others hate them. But one thing's for sure, you know them.
I am Melania, Blade of Mikola.
Yes, I know.
For the first few months after this game was released, the community was pretty rampant, going back and forth debating the quality of From Software's newest sources of broken controllers. And to this day, the back and forth of loving and hating these fights hasn't really seen any clarity, because they have plenty of praiseworthy aspects, as well as many well-known issues which people have complained about over and over again. And similar to my video where I discussed Elden Ring's replay value, I fall somewhere in the middle of this giant cesspool of opinions. As a whole, I really like a lot of these fights, but I'd be lying if I said there weren't times that I felt at least an eighth as frustrated as those who write 20-page articles calling the game trash. So in this video, I'd like to express my thoughts on the issues with Elden Ring's bosses, while also having a chance to talk about what I think they get right. But since a lot of this video will be focused on the negatives, I want to start by going over what this game's bosses get right, and why, for the most part, I really enjoy them. So it's hard to mention what Elden Ring bosses do right, without talking about a point you've probably heard 1.5 million times. They have really cool spectacle. For a while now, this series has had a myriad of bosses with awesome designs, beautiful arenas, and attacks that feel like they're straight out of a shonen. But with Elden Ring, you can tell that they really wanted to push the boundaries of this aspect and bring us some of the coolest, most legendary encounters in gaming, and I think it's fair to say that they succeeded. From Godric replacing his arm with a dragon head early in the game, to Renala taking us on a trip to one of the most beautiful boss arenas of all time, to Rykard dragging us down into the depths of hell, to Dragonlord Placidusax just existing. Oh yeah, also Radon flies into the air and comes crashing down like a literal meteor.
That's the coolest thing I've ever seen.
And to go along with these visuals, we were treated with yet another game filled with incredible boss music. While I think Bloodborne's soundtrack is superior, and I might also prefer Dark Souls 3's tracks overall, this game still gives you exactly what you're expecting in terms of epic boss themes. And while I know there will be some haters on this point, and I will be going slightly against this later in the video, these bosses have some of the most satisfying movesets in the whole series. Godric is a super well put together early game boss that feels just right in terms of challenge while also being a lot of fun. Radagon is a near perfect fight that has some of the most fluidly timed and satisfying attacks ever. Melania, while not a perfect boss, still spends a lot of her fight giving the player an absolute rush if they're able to hang with her. And while I don't really get a whole lot out of the mini-bosses these days, and there are a lot that are either unnoteworthy or badly designed, if you were able to show a fan of Demon's Souls in 2009 that FromSoft made a game with this many small-time opponents, that each had a ton of work put into designing their moves, how could they not be excited? Ultimately, what Elden Ring's bosses do best is they give you a really good taste of many of the aspects that people love From Software bosses for. Unfortunately, however, while these bosses provide many surface level aspects that we all love, it's once you take a closer look at how these bosses fight that you realize why it's not all fun and games. Now, in order to discuss the issues with this game's bosses, we need to look at how Elden Ring's bosses hit a bit different from the ones in the previous games. Like I said, this game feels like it was FromSoft trying their best to have the most impressive and epic boss lineup yet, and while they arguably succeeded in some ways, it feels like somewhere in the mix there had to be a compromise, leading to some of the issues which caused some of them to cross the line into being unfair. Think of it like this. Bosses in Dark Souls 3 are like adequately sized, well-made beds. They're pretty nice looking beds overall, but most importantly, they're neatly made without any compromises. Then Elden Ring bosses are like huge, glamorized beds. On the surface, they look noticeably more impressive than the Dark Souls 3 ones, and when you glance at it, it seems to be well made. But when you pull back the quilts, the sheets underneath are ruffled and untidy. The thing about the bosses in the previous games is, despite them being very challenging, they usually always follow a rule where if you successfully dodge a combo of their attacks, you are guaranteed a window to attack them right after. This causes most of the best bosses in Dark Souls 1, Dark Souls 3, and Bloodborne to feel kind of like a dance, where you and the boss take turns trying to hit each other. However, Elden Ring bosses are not here to give you windows to attack them. They're here to end you. No more, no less. and I think one of the best bosses to give us an example for this would be Morgott. While I don't think he's one of the hardest bosses in the game, mostly due to his weirdly low HP, this guy feels like he wants to be the king of never getting hit. Now, it's not that actually hitting him is impossible, it's very doable, but to me, I just feel like I can never get a clean run against this guy. It feels like every other time I hit him, I'm forced to trade damage while doing so, because half the time he finishes his combos, he chooses to fly across the arena, and half the time you try getting close to him after a combo finishes, he immediately follows it up with dagger strikes. I am terrible at this one boss in particular so much, and it sucks because actually defeating him isn't too tall a task, but every time I do it, I just don't feel satisfied. A lot of his moves are super fun to dodge, and I can have a lot of fun while doing it, but I just don't know if I'll ever click with this boss the way I have with, say, every single boss in Dark Souls 3. Now I know a lot of people will say I just suck and need to get better at him, which is fair. However, there are also some fights I find easy that other people will swear are just total trash, like Malekith. Sure, when he does hit you, it's really punishing, but honestly, I find his moves to be so fair and telegraphed that I rarely get hit by him these days anyway. Ultimately, everyone struggles more or less with different fights. They're subjective, they've been that way in all of these games. But there are some things I think we can all agree on, such as a few particular tricks these bosses tend to rely on. For example, input reading. Now I know it's not actually called input reading, and there's a lot more depth to it than I'll explain, but you likely know what I mean. It's when bosses only do something once the player takes an action, a near instant reaction which the comparatively slower human brain can't compete with. For example, when Malenia just stands around waiting for the player to attack, so she can instantly dodge it and charge at them. This is one of my least favorite things included in games, and while it certainly makes the bosses more challenging, it isn't in a way that's very fair or satisfying to overcome. There are also a lot of small factors that really start to pile up when added together, such as Elden Ring's infamous super delayed attacks, where a boss will wind up, hold their weapon for what feels like an eternity, and then immediately strike when the player least expects. This isn't inherently a bad idea, but sometimes it just feels really out of place, like when Godfrey literally pauses in mid-air before doing his overpowered grab attack. Moves like this just feel like they're deliberately designed to mess with the player. There's also Elden Beast, who, aside from annoyingly running away from the player half the time, also commits possibly the biggest sin in the entire game, overlapping attacks, with the best example being this yellow orb that follows the player for what feels like a solid minute, meanwhile it's also free to attack you as much as it wants. And this leads to my next point. We all know the worst thing about Elden Ring boss fights. Something even those who praise Elden Ring's bosses have to admit. The gank fights. FromSoft has learned so much over the years, and I feel like they've slowly taken many criticisms of their past work seriously, and worked around them when making their new games. So that being said, I have no idea what happened that led them to bring back unfair duo bosses like in Dark Souls 2. They've literally shown us, in Dark Souls 3 especially, that they finally know how to make consistently fair duo fights. You make one enemy fast and aggressive, and the other slow but hard hitting, or make one focus on melee while the other sticks to ranged attacks. So taking two super fast enemies that also both have ranged attacks and putting them together while also being able to respawn each other multiple times throughout? Yeah. That sounds about right. One of the biggest problems with Elden Ring, which Nasu kindly pointed out in a video of his, is that Elden Ring bosses sometimes feel like they're playing a different game than you. For example, in Sekiro, the boss fights were allowed to be way faster than any found in the games that came before it, because Sekiro found the perfect solution, deflecting. In that game, bosses can basically move as fast as they want, because they also gave the player the ability to deal with that level of aggression, since deflecting is a lot faster than rolling. But in Elden Ring, sometimes it feels like the bosses are playing Sekiro, meanwhile you're still stuck playing Dark Souls 3. I mean, if someone had the ability to place Malenia into Sekiro, that would be awesome. Deflecting her attacks would be so much fun. Now, some people might argue that Elden Ring isn't like playing Dark Souls 3, because there are more overpowered tools at your disposal. But ultimately, the player shouldn't be required to rely on their equipment. Like, as crazy as it sounds, in theory, it should be possible to beat every boss in the game using only your fists. And while most people likely wouldn't be up to the challenge, in Dark Souls 3, that is totally doable. So while using crazy overpowered builds does level the playing field, it shouldn't be necessary for most people to look up what the best weapons and spells are just so they can beat the game. There's also the elephant in the room being spirit summons, and I don't really want to dig too deeply into that debate. In short, yes, they make the game a lot easier. I just simply don't use them because they make the game way less enjoyable to me. I mean, why do you think I'm making this video? Because I love the rush of fighting challenging bosses. And adding an ally that distracts the boss for half of the fight just ruins the fun from my point of view. But for someone who just wants to get through the game, I won't ever hate on them for making the choice to use it. I just think that they're irrelevant when discussing the actual fairness of the bosses. So in conclusion, Elden Ring bosses are not what I would call a perfectly fair and balanced challenge. Many of them have tricks up their sleeve which basically force the player to go off and find a few tricks of their own in order to compete with them. So considering everything I just said, it might sound crazy, but I honestly still really love this game's main bosses as a whole. While they don't have the same level of perfection and fairness that some of the previous games thrive off of, it's not like the fights in their entirety are just poorly built from the ground up. Even for the non-duo bosses I criticized in this video, I don't think all of them are bad fights overall. They just often tend to have one trick or gimmick that keeps them from being actual perfection. But 90% of the time, I usually just have fun while fighting them. It's just that with this game compared to the others, if someone has a take that they hate this game's bosses, I think that's fair. Like, if someone tried to argue that Gale from Dark Souls 3 is an unfair, poorly balanced mess, my response would be, no, you're wrong. But with Elden Ring, I'm not going to die on a hill trying to say that they're perfect the way they are, and you just need to get good. While it is technically possible to master every fight in this game, a lot of the tactics you're forced to rely on come down to using the right equipment and specific builds, and I know not everyone is willing to do so. I actually mentioned in a previous video that my biggest issue with Elden Ring bosses is that I don't think there are enough main ones to justify running through the whole game to fight them, considering that I'm not a speedrunner. And after stating that, I've since realized that the DLC is inevitably going to fix that issue. Plus, if you look at most of these games, the best bosses pretty much always tend to be in the DLCs. So I'm sure we've got a lot of fun and controversy to look forward to. Honestly, the main reason I made this video is because I was going to make a different video listing my 10 favorite bosses in this game, but then I was already able to imagine the absolute fallout that would be the comment section, because I wouldn't be willing to go over all the intricate problems with the game's bosses, while simultaneously talking about why I love my favorite ones. But now, this video exists, and whenever people say I'm not addressing the boss's issues in enough detail, I can just refer them to this, rather than typing 10 paragraphs explaining that I know they aren't perfect. So now that this is out of the way, you can look forward to my next video, which will be ranking my 10 favorite bosses in Elden Ring. So I'll see you guys in that one. Oh, and subscribe, I guess, if you like the content. See ya.